The ongoing coronavirus crisis is giving us economists so much to analyze about. I was still skeptical on whether I should make this video, but while on my jog during my outdoor exercise time quota today, I was listening to IMF's latest briefing on their World Economic Outlook, links in the description. And just listening to how much application to what we are learning in class has given me the impetus to create this presentation. So welcome to this presentation on expansionary fiscal policy and debt relief at times of the coronavirus. This presentation today is a little bit different, with a little bit more focus on the application side of fiscal policy and debt relief, to help us put into perspective what is being done around the world and what is being suggested to deal with the coronavirus. However, we'll still ensure we are focusing on exam type questions, and therefore this presentation will focus on answering two exam type questions. The first, evaluate the effectiveness of the expansionary fiscal policy being introduced around the world to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. And the second, evaluate the effectiveness of debt relief that is being suggested by the IMF to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Let's start with the first question on the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policy to deal with this pandemic. I'm going to include the question that we are answering on every slide related to the question on top, so that you remember to always focus on the question when answering exam type questions. As usual, we first need to ensure that we fully understand what an expansionary fiscal policy is before we start answering the question. So a quick recap. An expansionary fiscal policy is when the government increases government spending and or decreases taxation to increase economic growth. In other words, an expansionary fiscal policy is when governments introduce a stimulus package or a fiscal stimulus to the economy. In this period of time where economic output is expected to contract due to this pandemic, as much as -3% according to IMF's outlook for the global economy, it is not surprising, therefore, that governments all around the world are trying to implement very generous fiscal stimulus packages. The US, UK, France, Germany, South Korea, and Malaysia, for example, has outlined a whole package of increased government spending to support those either unemployed or on furlough, and tax relief for businesses. Governments are also being very proactive in spending more in the healthcare sector to support them. The UK government, for example, has pledged to support the NHS at whatever costs. There is obviously a human element to this, but economically, these are all done to avoid the output falling too much. In fact, the IMF themselves have mentioned that without this fiscal support, the world economy would shrink by more than 3% this year. So now we've fulfilled the knowledge and application part of our first question. Let's move on to our analysis. So how would an expansionary fiscal policy help the economy at a time where the whole world is facing this pandemic? Let's start with a situation where economic activity has fallen because of the crisis. Remember the aggregate demand formula? Yep, it's AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So let's start with a simple one. If the government increases spending, for example on healthcare, there'll be increased government spending, which is an increase in G, which would then lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which would consequently lead to an increase in economic growth. In addition, if the government is providing more transfer payments, for example, to those who lost their jobs due to the pandemic, or in the UK's case, paying workers who are temporarily not working, or what they call on furlough, or in the US, even a one-off payment to every taxpayer, this will give people at least some money, assuring their incomes, so that they can continue to maintain their consumption, and so the consumption component would be higher than without this support, and the AD would also be higher than if without the support. Similarly, many governments around the world are also providing tax reliefs to businesses so that the businesses' cost of production can be lower, ensuring that their profits do not fall as much so that they can continue to invest in their business or avoid going bankrupt altogether, keeping investments high and aggregate demand high. However, will these policies be effective? It is widely recognized that such policies will not be able to offset the huge negative impacts brought by the pandemic. but at least it could reduce the negative impact of it. So let's try to look at a few different evaluation points. The first is with regards to huge debts. People are slightly worried that such a big increase in government spending and a decrease in taxes could be very strenuous on the government's budget. In fact, budget deficits will be huge due to this fiscal stimulus. A big budget deficit could lead to a huge debt, and huge debts could lead to even further problems such as a fall in investor confidence, opportunity cost, and the crowding out effect. Please refer to the presentation on fiscal deficits and debt to go through these points one by one. The link is available in the description below. Many are also actually concerned over future tax increases to fund all of the current fiscal stimulus. So overall, if the government implements an expansionary fiscal policy now, there will be a big budget deficit now, which will lead to huge debts which need to be paid back in the future. This would require governments to raise funds. And how would they do that, you ask? Of course, by increasing taxes again or decreasing spending again. Therefore, future living standards could actually be affected and decreased. But even if people have money but are not confident that their income levels could be maintained, they might still not spend now, and therefore consumption would still remain low. The same logic would affect business investments. So it is possible that aggregate demand now, even with all the stimulus, will remain low due to concerns over the future. Therefore, long-run growth may still remain low. Even short-run growth may still remain low. The other concern is actually, can governments even afford spending so much now and incurring such big fiscal deficits? In other words, is there enough fiscal space for the government to increase spending and cut taxes? The answer given by the IMF was it depends on which government. Some governments may have the fiscal space to do this, such as developed economies who can borrow at low interest rates or who have gone into the crisis with strong economic fundamentals, with stable growth, high productivity, etc. But not all economies can afford this. Lots of low-income countries have actually very low fiscal space. And this means that they can't borrow altogether or have to borrow at very high interest rates. And this means that they won't be able to spend or decrease taxes to try to stimulate the economy. In fact, a lot of developing economies are already high in debt and therefore will not afford to spend that much more to handle this crisis. The story continues when we try to answer the second exam type question in this presentation. But for now, the points that have been covered so far can fulfill all the assessment objectives required to answer the first question on evaluate the effectiveness of the expansionary fiscal policy being introduced around the world to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Remember, even in a 25-mark questions for all you A-level economists, you will only need to provide 2 points in 2 paragraphs to prove your knowledge, application, and analysis. I've actually provided you with 3 here in the slide title analysis, but you should only choose 2 in fact. And for evaluations, you need 2 points in 2 paragraphs. I've also provided you with 3 in the 2 slides before this on huge debts and future tax increases. So choose only 2 of those. And for a 25-mark question, don't forget a conclusion. I think this issue on fiscal space on this specific slide could actually be a good concluding point. On to the next question then, which is to evaluate the effectiveness of debt relief that is being suggested by the IMF to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. This question is part of development economics, which is actually covered in year 2 of A-level economics, but could also be a good extension for everyone who is learning about macroeconomic policies. So first, let us ensure that we cover the knowledge criteria of what debt relief is. Debt relief is a partial or total forgiveness of debt, or the slowing or stopping of debt growth owed by individuals, corporations, or nations. Our focus here is obviously on nations. And just to put a little bit more context to this question, Let's have a look at a headline where the IMF has given debt relief to its poorest members and also calling for the private sector to join this debt relief effort. Why would this be useful for a country in debt? Please refer to the presentation on fiscal deficit and national debt part 2 if you can't remember. The link is in the description below. Remember, if a country has lots of debt, this means that they also have to service the debt. In other words, they have to pay the interest on the loans they have taken or to even settle their debts altogether. This usually comes first, before any development spending. Governments have to spend on servicing their debts even before spending on any development projects or on fiscal stimulus. In the case today, poor countries won't even have much money left to spend on basic healthcare spending. So, if their debts are cancelled or reduced, they no longer need to service their debt. And instead of spending money on servicing their debt, so instead of paying the lenders the interest payments or to settle their debt, governments can now use the money to spend on improving their healthcare facilities to enable a better response to the pandemic. In addition, the government may also be able to help workers who are unemployed or businesses who are struggling to survive in this crisis. Another reason why debt relief could be effective is because if there is a partial or total forgiveness of debt, this means that the debt burden will be reduced, which could then lead to increased investor confidence on this economy, as it will be less likely that they will default on their debt. This will enable governments to borrow more easily, which would then enable them to spend more on the economy to provide a fiscal stimulus to deal with this crisis. However, just in case you haven't realized, we are now moving to the evaluation part of the question. So, however, debt relief is not an easy thing to carry out. Even the IMF has its limitations. If we go back to the earlier headline, the IMF can give debt relief on the loans that they have provided, but countries borrow from the private sector as well. And therefore, even the IMF can only propose or call for debt relief. But why is this so difficult to do? Just imagine, if you've lent someone money and now you're saying that they don't have to pay it back. Obviously, lenders will be very reluctant to do this. And imagine this now in billions of dollars. How much spillover effect will it have on other economic activities? If we were going a little bit into accounting, if you're lending money to someone, that money is considered an asset for you. And therefore, you could use that asset to get more lending to do other forms of investments. With debt relief, now your assets are wiped out. Imagine the strain on that investor himself, and consequently the strain on national economy, the national financial system, and then the global financial system. With this strain, it is possible that global output will reduce and economic growth rates will also fall. Another problem with debt relief is the moral hazard that it creates. Moral hazard happens when there is a lack of incentive to guard against risk when one is protected from its consequences. In this case, if governments know that debt relief is possible, they may be more reckless in their borrowing and spending. In other words, debt relief could simply encourage governments to get into debt again, believing once more that they will simply be bailed out or relieved from their debt. This hazard could be further intensified if the government regime is corrupt. Therefore, long-term sustainable growth will not be achieved with debt relief. We've now come to the end of this presentation. Hopefully this has given you some context on fiscal policies being implemented by governments in the face of this crisis, and has given you an idea on how to structure exam-type questions. If you have any questions, please do ask. The homework this time? Just continue following the news. Seriously, it's pretty exciting now. Goodbye.